Kunta Kinte's story, The Theme of Nature. Nature is a strong theme that is continuously utilized throughout the Roots series. Nature is a powerful resource that is used to make white people more powerful and help Africans throughout their time of slavery. Also, nature is compared with slaves and contrasts African life to American life. Because of nature, many slaves have lost sight of where they naturally came from and how unnatural American life is.
African community versus American community. In the Roots series, the African communities and lands were very different. In the African community, it seemed everyone was family. One example that would show this is when every boy in Kunta Kinte's tribe was sent to become men together as if they were brothers. Another example would be when Kunta was sent to catch the chicken and he bumped into another tribe. Instead of being held captive, they laughed it off and made sure he was okay and let him free. Also, a prime example of how much they care and value not only their lives but others as well is when they were teaching the boys to become men and the instructors taught them to surround their enemies from the south, east, and west so they would have an option to go and no one gets hurt because a Mandinka warrior's purpose is to protect, not to kill. Their community values reflect on their land that's thriving with many resources, green, grass, healthy trees, and wildlife everywhere. In the American community, everyone seems greedy and only cares about themselves. An example would be caring for the slaves, because the slaves all lived in shed with no floors, no shoes, and maybe a bed, while the other slave owners sat in their big comfortable houses, plenty of shoes, and maybe even a few carpets. Another example would be when Master Reynolds' brother began a relationship with his wife and later brought out his farm, leaving Master Reynolds with nothing. You can see how their value reflect on their land because there is little to no grass, the woods are outgrown and dangerous, almost no wildlife, and all of their resources are man-made. In conclusion, you can see there is a big difference between American and African communities in the series of Roots. Some of the African family-like communities continued with American slaves because they were still caring for each other when they never knew their ancestors or freedom, while there wasn't one white man who tried to help the slaves or each other break free from this terrible activity. Nature as a resource. Throughout the miniseries Roots, there were many occasions that African Americans would use their surroundings being nature, as a resource to stay alive and to help them get out of a situation. For example, when Kunta Kinte was working in the field, he found a semi-sharp rock. Now, I believe any other person would have just thought of it as a rock and nothing else, but Kunta saw it was an opportunity. He hid the rock in his pants and later sharpened it so he could break out of the chains on his legs. Even though this process did take him days to complete, he still managed to break the chains just using a rock. This is only one of the many great examples of African Americans using the nature around them as resources. When Kunta Kinte was back in Africa, his tribe and himself used nature for everyday living. Their houses were made from wood out of the trees and straw. They would wash their clothes in the river provided to them. They would make their clothes out of skins of animals and they took care of. In one particular scene, one of the goats was killed and Kunta immediately had to skin the animal. After they used the rest of the goat for food, their tribe also makes weapons to protect themselves, like spears and slingshots made out of wood. Also, poisonous darts. Lastly, the Mandinka tribe makes various types of instruments out of the nature around them. Drums, tambourines, shakers, etc. Kunta Kinte was going to make his brother a drum before he was captured.
Slaves as animals. In the first episode of Roots, we're introduced to Kunta Kinte, who at the time was a boy living in a small village located in Gambia, West Africa. In Gambia, animals were often used to teach positive life lessons to Kunta. As Kunta grows into a man, his responsibility is to look after the goats and to make sure they don't wander away from the village. While talking to his friend, a tiger gets a hold of the she-goat and attacks her. Kunta uses his slingshot to scare off the tiger. However, it's too late. The tiger had already killed the goat, and now Kunta has to skin the goat and take it home to his father. When he gives the skin to his father and explains to him what took place, Kunta's father begins to tell him a story about his childhood and how a similar incident happened to him as well. Kunta's father shows him a tiger tooth that he wears around his neck as a reminder to not let the same incident occur again. He gives Kunta the goatskin and tells him to always remember that day. The tiger tooth and the goatskin serve as life lessons about not letting your guard down. Animals were symbolic in Africa and were allowed to roam freely as nature intended. In the second episode of Roots is where we see nature become unbalanced. Slavery is introduced and blacks no longer were treated as human beings. Instead, they were captured, shackled, caged, and put on display like animals in a zoo. It was as if they were a new breed of undiscovered animals. Nature was in reverse in America. When being auctioned off, we hear Kunta being described as strong as an ox, can carry things like a mule, and wild like a monkey. Whites were allowed to inspect the captured blacks for diseases and fleas before bidding for them. Kunta was even branded like a cow or horse. He no longer had any rights or respect. He was sold and now belonged to Mr. Reynolds, who, like many slave owners, just saw him as property and not as a human. The Reynolds farm both housed animals and slaves. However, the animals were treated better than the slaves. The horses had shoes, the slaves did not. The animals were fed and given water, while the slaves got whatever food was left over. The animals roamed freely without any consequences. However, this was not the case for blacks. Kunta wore shackles on his feet so he wouldn't run. Fiddler had to be given permission in order to leave the farm. Fiddler was born into slavery, and it was natural for him to be treated as an animal. Kunta, however, knew what being treated as a human being was. In the third episode of Roots, Kunta runs away to find Fanta and is hunted down like an animal. He was being hunted because he was looked upon as a good work animal, and he was a property of Mr. Reynolds. He had no entitlement to human rights. He was a slave and could be nothing more. His running away meant that Mr. Reynolds would have lost his investment, and he had to have Kunta back. Once Kunta was recaptured, the slave catchers decided that they must teach him a lesson. They chop off his toes with no empathy for Kunta as a human being. They treat him like a runaway animal recaptured and taught the lesson to never run away again. As a slave, Kunta had to deal with being treated as sometimes less than an animal, and now he has to deal with losing his toes as punishment. Blacks weren't just slaves, but instead they were the new breed of work animals.
The manipulation of nature. Slave owners in Roots and throughout the time of slavery would utilize landscaping to prevent slaves from escaping. Although many of the slaves don't realize it, these white men have strategically placed them in a foreign country where they have no chance of escaping due to the location of the plantation and the natural color of their skin. Right off the bat, slaves are targeted because their skin color is brown, unlike the rest of the people living in North America that are white. In the beginning of Roots, Kunta and all the other slaves are forced onto a boat. Instantly, the slaves are estranged, trapped away at sea, and have no chance of escaping unless they want to take a chance of drowning. When Kunta Kinte is brought to the plantation, we can see how the landscaping can ease the mind of a worried slave owner. Behind the plantation, we can see high mountains, tall, rough grass, huge trees, and thick bushes. A slave would have a difficult time running through these treacherous fields for months, attempting to escape to the north or Africa. We notice this when Kunta tries to escape, running through hard dirt and a thick forest with no shoes and very little clothing. Kunta doesn't make it far before he is caught and whipped into obedience. On the other side of the plantation, we see a good length of open land. This helps slave owners to locate slaves easily, using dogs to track them down and attack them, and horses for slave hunters to travel on and trample them. Even if slaves were able to escape, they would never be able to return to Africa, because the barrier between North America and their home is miles of ocean that they never be able to travel across and survive. A second way slave owners are able to control slaves is by forcing them to interact with nature in ways that are cruel. We first see this when Kunta and many of the other slaves are forced to work on plantations.
When Kunta first begins working on the plantation, we see that slaves are regulated while picking cotton, and if they grow tired, they were yelled at, beaten, or even whipped until they continued working. Not only did slaves pick cotton, but they also had to carry buckets of fruit, trees, and branches. Slaves had to cut bushes, clean clothes using a well of water, cut grass using a small tool, and many other treacherous tasks that they didn't have a choice but to do. Slaves had to load heavy cargo, and even a very old, tired slave like Fiddler had to bend onto his weak knees and pick vegetables and fruits. We also see how slaves are forced to live in conditions that are unethical and cruel. Slaves have to sleep in cold barns, on a bed made of hay, or on the cold floor with hay on it. We also don't see slaves eating much food. Occasionally we see Fiddler giving Kunta Kinte food, or slaves eating some bland food, but we never see slaves eating food that they have grown and picked themselves. Slave owners have placed these slaves in a dilemma where they have to pick fresh plants and cook food for their owners, yet they aren't allowed to enjoy any of the food, only the leftover measly crumbs. These forced negative interactions play a major role in manipulating slaves. By forcing these slaves to live in terrible conditions and continuously work, owners have made it easy to make slaves obedient. Slave owners have made the small wonders in their life huge privileges for slaves. Instead of sleeping in a barn on the cold floors, slaves that worked well and had no intention of escaping were living in a decent, comfortable cabin. For slaves like Fiddler and Belle, this was an easy manipulation, since at one point they too were sleeping on hay in a barn but have been privileged with a better living environment. We see how broken, hardworking, obedient slaves have worked hard to reach the level of comfort that they have achieved. Fiddler even explains that he would never attempt to escape and lose all that he has earned. He doesn't do outside work, he can drink some alcohol, eat some warm, decent food, and sleep in a warm cabin unlike other disobedient slaves. Fiddler knows that if he disobeys his owner, he'll be forced to sleep in a cold barn like Kunta and work on the fields like the other underprivileged slaves. All his hard work will go to waste. This is a prime example of an owner completely manipulating nature and unnatural things to brainwash slaves. We also see how obedient slaves like Belle can live just as good as a white person if they are blindly loyal to their owners. After having her husband and children taken from her, Belle has been completely broken and lives to help her master and has no intention of escaping. On the other hand, we have Kunta Kinte, who has been caught trying to escape for a second time, living in a decent cabin on a bed made of hay with a fireplace. Now, although both of these slaves have been broken, we see how the slave that would never try to escape, Belle, is living so much better than all the other slaves. Belle is living in her own house with a stove, dining room table, bedroom, and many other items that are great privileges to many other slaves. Slave owners have forced slaves to live in a natural, unkind environment and have given them unnatural luxury items as a form of privilege and as a way of preventing slaves from wanting to escape. After viewing Roots, we can see how the theme of nature strongly affects the life of Africans and Americans. Nature can be used as a positive, lively resource to help Africans live in their own environment and as a tool to help them escape from their trapped lives as a slave. In contrast, nature is a tool used by white people to estrange Africans and gain control of them. This strong contrast in the use of nature shows how white men need slaves in nature to gain power and riches, while Africans use nature as a source of survival.